a Korean unification is the historical imperative of one people and one nation, and an aspiration that will bring significant benefits in terms of regional stability, living standards, and obviously an overall improvement of the economy. Of course, all attempts to move towards the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula cannot fail to acknowledge the unique and complex realities that characterize recent history and the current status quo. However, having lived in Australia for most of my life and been active for a number of years in the area of international trade, various roles in semi-government and private sector organisations, including the Australia Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I have seen firsthand the many soft diplomacy avenues that exist outside the ordinary channels of government that can still achieve material and lasting benefit for societies across borders. Of course, there are clear and obvious differences in the example of international engagement between Australia and the Middle East region and the challenges facing the Korean Peninsula. However, modest steps can contribute greatly to the breaking down of barriers of mistrust, ignorance, and misinformation, and pave the way for true cooperation and lasting connections that can stay largely unaffected by political concerns. In this respect, I will seek to draw from my background in order to highlight some of the avenues that non-government entities can and have employed in the past to achieve meaningful cross-cultural exchange across borders, and in many cases doing so from modest and wholly achievable beginnings. This can take many forms, from private sector initiatives in education and knowledge sharing to empowering communities on the ground with existing cross-border ties. Each relationship and positive connection formed chips away slowly at prejudice and fear and contributes to a more positive public discourse amounting to government pressure that can make larger aspirations like reunification feel tangible and within reach. To an extent, this is exactly what played out in the case of Australia and the Middle East. Governments, of course, play an important role in cross-cultural diplomacy and provide the regulatory framework for international relations. But in my experience working towards stronger engagement between two regions, the private sector initiatives and the work of community-led organisations to set the tone from which government followed. This has been evident in the fact that despite official government policy rarely shifting its default position for a number of years, the relationship in terms of trade and investment, cooperation and understanding has flourished and evolved. Of course, the individuals and entities that take the first steps in this path still had to overcome historical grievances, misconceptions, and misinformation in order to navigate the relationship, making it essential to establish educational strategies and cross-cultural awareness training for delegations and private sector. Measures like this can often be overlooked. However, they are, in my experience, extremely effective and rewarding for both sides. From an Arab perspective, the effort from an Australian to understand the local customs was always warmly received. And having led and hosted many delegations in both directions, I have noted how often it is these simple initial interactions that disarm human beings on both sides and remind us of our shared values. Even in a COVID-impacted world, we shouldn't lose this notion as we imagine the type of future engagement necessary to make change. Of course, the ultimate measures of this type of engagement is the material benefit it can produce for both sides. And in the case of Australia, many of the initial delegations from the private sector that visited the regions manifested in lasting outcomes to both regions in the form of shared expertise across industry and various exchange programs between people across borders. One of the most impactful were the partnerships formed in the education sector that in many ways underpinned the wide array of initiatives that have since formed. The international education sector, in conjunction with the private sector industry, sought to establish training and exchange programs, as well as the provision of scholarships that allowed tens of thousands of students coming to Australia for their education. These students often return to their home countries as individual ambassadors and advocates for Australia, and in many cases ended up in government positions and key decision-making roles across industry. In addition to this, Australians developed a much more intimate understanding of the region and its people, and it's my firm belief that it was these types of connections that formed the basis for significant steps forward in the level of engagement happening now at government level. Tourism, for example, although suffering from the recent impact of COVID, is a major avenue across cultural exchange between the regions, and it did not happen easily or by accident, as there were certain fears and a lack of information to overcome. Of course, in the case of the Korean Peninsula, tourism is not an option for the vast majority of people, but it is certainly the type of change that the international community could and should advocate for. What's relevant in the case of the Middle East and Australia was that it was, in fact, mostly specialized groups, often educational and supported by the private sector, groups like archaeological societies and food tours that made the first forays across borders that eventually paved the way for tourism to become mainstream and a major economic driver. Can one imagine that while border restrictions may exist across Korea, both private industry and the international community could take a more active role in supporting similar initiatives as a starting point between the regions? One of the benefits of the ties formed in education and tourism, particular is they have largely remained out of the realm of politics completely. But it is clear that in the case of the Korean Peninsula, this type of cooperation has yet to be realized on a large scale. And it is for this reason that international organizations like the United Nations are pivotal in helping both sides in the private sector to carve out a viable path through existing restrictions. The UN has established programs like the Peace Building Fund, which focuses on private sector partnerships that can support sustainable economic activities in conflict-affected communities. Programs like these are helpful not only because they attempt to uplift local communities economically, but the oversight of the UN can appease suspicions on both sides while initial progress is made. The most effective way to create a culture of change is through empowering and educating the communities themselves and ultimately making the case to the people on both sides of the inherent value of reunification, not only in terms of economic prosperity, but in a lost sense of shared values and common goals that can be hard to see amongst the noise. That is why we must take opportunities like these here today to continue to set a vision towards a more just and safer world, where we can look with optimism for the future of our children and beyond.